The Ted Cruz and Ilhan Omar confrontation was never just another feud between two politicians who dislike each other. It became important because it kept resurfacing at one of the most volatile intersections in American politics. Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, protest, foreign policy, and the struggle to decide which side gets to accuse the other of moral fraud without sounding like a propagandist. That is the real story. Not simply Cruz denouncing Omar, not simply Omar denouncing Cruz, but a larger battle over who gets to own the language of bigotry, loyalty, and democratic danger when both sides believe the other has weaponized moral outrage for years. That is why this pair matters, because Ted Cruz is not just a conservative senator. He is one of the right's sharpest courtroom-style arguers, a figure who turns ideological conflict into prosecutorial conflict. He likes to force the audience into a clean moral binary. If the left cannot clearly condemn a statement, a movement, or a protest culture he has decided is dangerous, then he treats that hesitation as proof of a deeper rot. Ilhan Omar is built for a very different kind of politics. She does not accept the right's chosen moral hierarchy as neutral. When conservatives suddenly discover outrage over anti-Semitism, campus speech, Middle East rhetoric, or protest extremism, she asks what they were doing during years of anti-Muslim panic, nationalist scapegoating, and selective patriotism. She does not merely reject the accusation. She often tries to reveal the system of accusation behind it. That is the confrontation. Cruz wants the audience to think Omar exposes the left's moral corruption. Omar wants the audience to think Cruz exposes the right's moral selectivity. That is why the pair lasts. A lot of political feuds fade because they depend on one scandal cycle. This one keeps renewing itself because it lives in a structural ambiguity that American politics still has not resolved. Can a movement that traffics in its own forms of suspicion and exclusion still plausibly present itself as the guardian against bigotry on the other side? And can a politician who has repeatedly argued that Muslims, immigrants, or pro-Palestinian activists are treated unfairly still avoid being trapped by every charge that she is soft on prejudice when it appears inside her own coalition? That is the entire fight. Cruz's politics are built on forcing that trap closed. He wants Omar to stand for a larger progressive failure. In his telling, the left always discovers nuance when the offending rhetoric comes from within its own cultural camp. It becomes context, misunderstanding, oversensitivity, or a bad faith smear. He treats that pattern as evidence that progressives do not actually care about universal moral standards. They care about preserving coalition innocence. Omar's politics work in reverse. She believes conservatives like Cruz use the language of universal standards only when it can be deployed as a weapon against the left. They talk about anti-Semitism, religious tolerance, and pluralism in one context, and then tolerate or excuse anti-Muslim demonization, xenophobic spectacle, and nationalist humiliation in another. So she therefore hears Cruz's moral clarity not as clarity, but as curation. That is why their arguments never settle. Each thinks the other is trying to launder factional power through the language of principle. That is what makes the pair so strong for long-form storytelling. Take the underlying issue of anti-Semitism, where so many of their conflicts either begin or get intensified. Cruz wants the public to think the problem is obvious. If language about Israel, Jewish influence, or protest movements keeps crossing into old tropes, then call it what it is. If Democrats hesitate, they reveal themselves. That simplicity is politically powerful because it gives audiences a clear villain and turns hesitation itself into evidence. Omar resists that simplicity because she thinks simplicity is exactly how bad faith moral politics wins. In her reading, Accusations are often selectively amplified, detached from broader context, and then used to flatten dissent, especially dissent about Israel, Gaza, U.S. foreign policy, and the behavior of institutions that conservatives otherwise distrust. She is not merely refusing the indictment, she is contesting the prosecution. That matters because once both sides are fighting over the legitimacy of the prosecution, the dispute is no longer only about the original statement. It becomes a battle over who is allowed to define moral seriousness in the first place. Cruz believes he exposes hypocrisy. Omar believes he manufactures it. There is also a personal symbolic layer that gives this pair unusual intensity. Cruz is one of the most loyally culture war figures on the right, and Omar is one of the most symbolically contested progressive figures in Congress. She is Muslim, foreign-born, openly critical of American power in certain contexts, and unwilling to perform gratitude politics on demand. That makes her almost uniquely useful to conservative moral campaigns. She can be portrayed not just as a political opponent, but as proof that liberal America protects people who do not, in the right's telling, respect its civilizational foundations. Omar understands that perfectly. That is why she often refuses to meet the accusation on its preferred terms. She does not want the public to think she is just one politician, clumsily defending herself from one controversy. She wants the public to see a pattern, a conservative movement that keeps selecting targets like her to dramatize its own claims about national decline. Said in that sense, she is always arguing on two levels at once. She answers the specific charge, but she also tries to answer the machinery that keeps producing the charge. That is why the conflict goes beyond personal dislike and into narrative architecture. Cruz wants Omar to symbolize the left's corrupted moral hierarchy. Omar wants Cruz to symbolize the right's corrupted moral hierarchy. Neither symbol can be surrendered without losing the larger story. This becomes especially potent whenever the Israel-Palestine issue heats up, because that issue scrambles American moral language faster than almost any other. Protest, free speech, religious identity, anti-Semitism, anti-Arab racism, state violence, and national loyalty all start colliding at once. Now, Cruz thrives in those moments because he can insist that the left is refusing to say the obvious. Omar thrives in those moments because she can insist that the right is policing the obvious too selectively to be trusted. That is why the pair feels exhausting and unfinished at the same time. Exhausting, because both have made their moral maps clear for years. Unfinished, because the country still has not decided whose map sounds more credible. There is another reason this pair matters. It shows how contemporary politics treats accusation itself as a form of power. Cruz understands that once you successfully attach a moral stain to an opponent, every future statement from that opponent gets filtered through it. Omar understands that if you let the stain settle without attacking the process that produced it, then you lose more than one argument. You lose the public's willingness to hear you on adjacent questions too. That is why her responses so often try to widen the lens. She is fighting for more than vindication. She is fighting against narrative capture. Cruz, meanwhile, is fighting for narrative closure. He wants the audience to feel there is nothing more to interpret. The left equivocates. The facts are plain. The moral distinction is obvious. That rhetoric is powerful because people exhausted by ambiguity often prefer closure, even when the underlying issue remains messy. This is what makes the pair perfect for your channel style. It has identity tension, congressional conflict, foreign policy stakes, protest politics, and a larger unresolved question underneath it all. When both sides accuse the other of selective morality, how do voters decide which moral language is real and which is mostly tactical? Cruz's answer is to force the left to answer the hardest possible question every time. Omar's answer is to force the right to answer why its own moral consistency disappears so often outside the chosen case. Cruz says the problem is progressive indulgence toward prejudice inside its own coalition. Omar says the problem is conservative indulgence toward prejudice whenever it serves nationalism or power. That is the whole fight. And maybe that is the best way to end it. Ted Cruz wants the audience to think the danger lies in a politics that cannot condemn what it should condemn without evasive footnotes. Ilhan Omar wants the audience to think the danger lies in a politics that condemns loudly only when condemnation can be used to discipline enemies. Cruz says moral clarity is being sabotaged by ideological loyalty. Omar says moral clarity is being impersonated by ideological loyalty. Cruz wants the country to see hypocrisy. Omar wants the country to see selection. And because American politics still rewards both prosecutors and counter-prosecutors, the confrontation never fully closes. It just reopens in new settings. That is why this pair still matters. Not because they are the loudest people in the room, but because they embody one of the most combustible questions in the country. Who gets to talk about bigotry, dissent, and democratic belonging as though they are speaking for principle instead of for tribe? Cruz thinks he knows. Omar thinks she knows. The public is still deciding.